All right, how is everybody today?
Great.
Wonderful.
Good. So if you didn't bring a Bible this week, it's okay. Next week, bring one. If you don't have one, we'll have some here. We're going to kind of do some comparisons of some scriptures and stuff. This week, we're just going to go over the overview of what Mark is. But first, let's pray. Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to delve deeper into your word. We thank you for the chance to learn more about how your books were constructed, about how the library of the Bible is important even today. Lord, we ask that you grant us the understanding to really see what you're trying to accomplish with these words, with these stories. And we ask that you help us to understand how they're still relevant in our lives today. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So, like I said before, this is the kind of the structure of Mark today. This is 6 weeks we're going to go through. I promise some of them are going to be a whole lot more interesting than this one, but we got to get this out of the way for you to understand the other stuff. So the basics of Mark's gospel. We're going to look at the authorship. But let me just tell you first. When I was growing up, I grew up in a tradition that was more conservative. And I always loved the Old Testament stories because they were action-packed. It was like the difference between watching, what was it, People's Court versus Looney Tunes. People's Court, to me, seemed a whole lot more like the New Testament. It was boring. It was kind of cut and dry. The Old Testament, there was always some intrigue and something going on behind the scenes. When I was in seminary, I took Hebrew because I thought, hey, this will help me understand stuff. It just left me with a lot more questions. But it wasn't until I took a class with Hal Taussig. He's a New Testament scholar. You might possibly see a book called The New Testament, and it was if the New Testament was reconstructed today, what would it look like? And he got together with a whole lot of scholars and made that happen. And it's an amazing piece of work. I took a class with him over the summer one year, and usually in these intensive courses you have a whole lot of front-loaded assignments that you turn in. You have assignments that you turn in during the thing, and then you have assignments that you turn in before the end of the semester. We showed up to the class thinking that we had missed all the pre-assignments. And he said, no, don't worry about it. And then we asked, well, what about the assignments due at the end of this class session of 2 weeks? And he said, no, don't worry about it. So that meant 100% of our grade came from what we learned in the class and what we were able to write, and it scared the you-know-what out of us. But during this class, I started to see the New Testament in a whole new way. So one of the things that he did, and one of the things I'll ask you to do, is during this class, imagine there are no other Gospels. Some of the letters of Paul have been written, but there are no other Gospels aside from Mark. And I think that Mark is a good place to start. When I first got into ministry, I thought John was the best place to start, and now I've kind of changed my mind. John's a good place for some people, but Mark is amazing. Part of it's because it's overlooked. There's no birth narrative, there's no resurrection stories in the original text. And so during Advent that we just went through, all the scriptures that you heard were from Matthew and Luke. They weren't from, and one from John. They weren't from Mark, because Mark didn't have any. So obviously I'm not going to cover the entirety of this book in 6 weeks, but we're going to hit some major points and hopefully kind of give you a good idea of Mark. So there's a claim that Mark was written by Peter's interpreter. Now, that may or may not be true, but I want to tell you a little bit about authorship in the Bible in general and in the New Testament as well. So, Mike wants to write a book. What are you into, Mike? What hobbies?
Golf.
Mike wants to write a book on golf. Who's going to read a book that Mike writes on golf?
Golfers.
Are they really going to read a book that Mike writes on golf? But if he says, here's my book, and I'm going to put Lee Trevino, I think that's a famous guy, right?
Yeah.
Lee Trevino, one of those golfers, who's going to read it now? More people are going to read it now. That's the way authorship was in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. So a lot of times, a book will be ascribed to a person, but was not written by that person. Now, I know that bothers some people, but there are things called small t truths and big T truths. And the small t truths, sometimes we have to learn that it's okay for those to not necessarily be 100% accurate, because what we're going for is the big T truth. So Mark was ascribed to Peter's interpreter. That may or may not have been true, but it's not important who wrote Mark. What's important that Mark was written. Somebody once said that, well, what if a disciple wrote it? Well, let's think about that. Average, old age in the New Testament would have been 45-ish. That'd be, if you could make it to 45, you were doing good. Now, most disciples didn't make it to 45. That didn't work for them. When you started working, your father's trade would be 13, okay? That'd be the age that you start working for your mother or father doing the family business. When Jesus calls the disciples, they're probably 13 or 14. We'll just say 13 because it's the low end of the spectrum. They walk around with Jesus for 3 years, right? So how old are they?
16.
16. They're 16 years old when Jesus dies. Okay, up to this point, they're illiterate. They speak Aramaic. They might understand some Hebrew. In fact, the scrolls, they could go to where the scroll said the stuff, but they might not be able to read the Hebrew that's in the scroll. The Latin Septuagint would have been out, but none of them would have been able to read Latin at this time. And obviously, they might have understood a few words in all the different languages for commerce or for trade, but they weren't literate. So Jesus dies at 13, or when they were 16. What else happens in the New Testament?
The resurrection.
No, they would have still been that age.
You mean,
Okay, better yet, when would Jesus have died and been resurrected? What would the year be? 0?
Zero.
Can't divide by it, but you can use it as a number. All right, now Mark, the earliest of the 4 Gospels, was written around 70. Do we have a problem with our math here? John would have been written between 90, and some really new work suggests as late as 160. It would have been really hard to write a gospel. Now, I say that not to scare anybody about the authorship, because what's important is these stories were handed down in oral tradition. The Old Testament, from Genesis to Ezekiel, wasn't written down until the captivity in Babylon. So all those early stories were passed on by word of mouth, just like these stories.
Is that how they live longer?
Well, and there's
I'm just looking at some of them live to be 900 years.
there's a lot of theories on that, and I've got some neat stuff written about that. Some people suggest that if they didn't actually live that long, that those are family names. But then some people say, well, genetics, it was still different. Maybe the time counting was different. I don't know.
Right.
But yeah, that's a very interesting topic, and I do have
They didn't
some.
even have calendars back then. They didn't have calendars really to the Aztecs.
Well, the Aztecs were so far away that
Yeah.
that wouldn't have.
Yeah.
Now they did count the seasons, and of course they had the Roman calendar in the New Testament, which would have been, and of course they would have had a month after Caesar or something, so that kind of changed the years as well. But the time frame of Mark, now I put 70 here, but I want to say this. It could have been before 70 or after 70. And here's why. Some people say that it was before 70. And I'm of the camp that says it's after 70. In the year of 70 AD, the temple was destroyed by the Romans. They finally had enough. We'll look at that, I think, in week 3, where Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple that's coming. Well, we believe that it already had happened, and that's why they were able to write about it. So you have the time frame. Now, Who was Mark's audience, do you think?
The Romans, wasn't it? The Gentiles.
John's was more towards the Gentiles. Mark was to anyone that could read. Because literacy was so low at that time. Only certain people could read. Now, the oral tradition would still survive. And the oral tradition still survives to this day. That's why we have preachers. But the book was written to write down everything because, oh my goodness, what if we forget this stuff? So it was anyone that could read. Mark used oral tradition in another writing called Q, which is some sayings that Jesus may have said, to put together his gospel.
If it was written after 70, why would the destruction of the temple not been mentioned?
Well, the destruction of the temple is mentioned, and
As fact or as
it's going to happen, Mark writes it in a narrative form and not as a historical book. So we have to think of, a lot of times when I do introductory Bible class, I say the Bible isn't a science book and it's not a history book, but it does detail the history of a people from their point of view. So Mark basically is writing a story kind of as it happens. One of the things that, when we look at the evolution of the study of Mark, which we're about to do, one of the first things that we see is Mark's really clumsy in writing. So we know that Mark, just from reading the Greek, we know that Mark would have been a second language learner, or maybe a third language learner, but Greek or Latin would not have been his first language to write this stuff down in. He didn't have a full command of the language. In fact, you'll notice in part of your homework, yes, there's homework, read the book of Mark. It's not that long. That's all you have to do. That's all the homework. You'll notice a lot of sentences start with, immediately they went over here. Immediately they went over here. Immediately they did this. He didn't understand the language well enough to have more nuance in it. And so a lot of people say that he's really clumsy in his writing. Let's see. So some people, before we understood that Mark was written before Matthew, some people thought that Mark, all he did was abbreviate what Matthew did. We know now that Mark was earlier, that the only things that were out were some of Paul's letters at that time. After that, now, we became interested in what Mark was chronicling. Now, this would be the history aspect of it. Hey, there are some events here that actually happened in history that Mark was trying to get put out. Then, years later, we started thinking, well, Mark is compiling all the oral tradition stories in one place so that they could be accessible. Now, these last two, Chronicler and Compiler, that's 1700s that we thought one and 1800s that we thought another. So you see how our understanding of Mark has changed throughout the years. In fact, we didn't really understand Middle Eastern and Near Eastern customs, and we're still learning stuff to this day about how things are done. There's a story about, I think it's in Proverbs, that be nice to your enemies, it'll be like burning coals on their heads. Well, we think, oh, be nice to somebody and that'll just burn them up. That's not what it meant. The actual intent of that story is radical hospitality, and the way it was discovered, there was an archaeologist on a dig, and there was a Bedouin who was kind of his guide of the area, and the Bedouin kept, swindling him a little bit. Hey, hold this necklace for me. So he'd hold the necklace, and he'd say, hey, that's $50. But I don't want the necklace. Well, you took it from me, so you must have wanted it. So this guy has swindled this archaeologist all this time. They were in separate huts, and it gets very cold at night, and so they had fires. And if your fire goes out in the middle of the night, you're sunk because it's so cold. And so he went over to this Bedouin who had been pretty much taking him. He's like, oh man, I'm going to get it now. And he says, I need some coals for my fire. And the Bedouin hands him a pot with no handle with hot coals in it. Well, if it had a handle, you couldn't really carry it, right? Because the heat would rise and it'd burn your hands, so he had to carry it on his head back to his hut. And the thing is radical hospitality, because the Bedouin said, I'm not charging you for this. This is life-giving. And he realized at that moment that that scripture had nothing to do with being nice to someone so much that they decided that they were just burned up by your niceness. It had to do with radical hospitality, being nice to somebody who you might have been an enemy with, would keep them alive, keep their children alive, and it was the right thing to do. So anyway, we go from the compiler Mark to the clever Mark. In the 1900s, we started to realize, this is about 1950s, we started to realize that Mark might have had multiple layers. And we'll talk about this later on. When we start to learn about stories and words that would have only been used in a certain context. We'll study this one a little more, the Legion, the Gerasene demoniac. Legion is the name for what?
The army.
It's a body of troops in the Roman army. And by Legion bowing down before Jesus, what is it saying? That the Romans will bow down before Jesus. And that's just one layer in that story. When we cover that story, we'll find that there are so many more layers to this. And when we started looking at it, we were like, not me, the people in the 1950s, they said, wow, there's probably more to Mark than just compiling oral tradition or looking at what happened or just writing down some stories. So we started to think that Mark was a little more clever, and then in the 1970s, we started to see Mark as creative. Now, why would we see Mark as creative? We started to understand that there's a thread through Mark that didn't make sense any other way, and we're going to talk about that real quick. So we got time. Yeah, we got a lot of time. All right, so who's got a Bible handy? Jane, can you look at Mark 1:11? Jerry, can you look at Mark 1:43 to 45? Mike, Mark 3:11 to 13. Wayne, Mark 13:14, and Jody, Mark 16:1 through 8. All right, you got Mark 1:11? Go ahead.
And a voice from heaven said, "You are my dearly loved Son, and you bring me great joy."
Okay, so we'll talk about this in the sermon next week, but that's during what?
Baptism.
Baptism. Is there anything that's odd about that?
Anything odd?
Read it again.
Read it again.
And a voice from heaven said, "You are my dearly loved Son, and you bring me great joy."
Anything weird about that? Anything different than what we remember? In John, in the baptism, and in Matthew, Jesus comes out of the water and the Spirit of the Lord parts the heavens and says, this is my Son. Saying it to everyone. In Mark, he's only saying it to Jesus.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So there's a little bit of a clue there. Now, I will say this, that Mark doesn't have a birth narrative or a resurrection narrative in the original text. If you notice, the letters of Paul don't talk about a birth narrative or a resurrection narrative in Paul's letters. There is some argument that Mark and Paul did not know about the birth narrative or did not know about the resurrection narrative. There are some scholars that say that that was added later because it was in keeping with tradition, in keeping with what Matthew would later write about fulfilling the prophecy in Isaiah. All right, who had Mark 1:43 to 45?
Okay. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. "See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in the lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere.
Okay, what Jane first read was God saying only to Jesus, "You are my Son." And now we hear Jesus telling people, "Don't tell anyone what I'm doing." All right, so we're starting to see a theme of secrecy in Mark. Why would Jesus not want people to know what he's doing?
So you could have some privacy.
Well, privacy is a good thing, but if you're the Messiah, do you want privacy?
Well, you don't want mobs, maybe.
You don't want mobs, but you also want to live.
That's right, the Romans.
Because the Romans, they hear, oh, this guy's out healing folks, that's, only God can do that. Well, who is God in the Romans world is Caesar. Now we got a problem, we got a conflict of interest, and so if we've got people being healed by Jesus left and right and talking about it, which they did. All right, Mark 3:11-13. Who had that?
I got it. And whenever those possessed by evil spirits caught sight of him, the spirits would throw them to the ground in front of him, shrieking, "You are the Son of God." But Jesus sternly commanded the spirits not to reveal who he was.
All right, so the demons know who he is. And they say who he is, and he tells them to be quiet and not say who he is. Again, we don't want to attract too much attention. It could cause problems. And Mark 13:14, that's when.
Yeah. The day is coming when you will see the sacrilegious object that causes desecration standing where he should not be. Then those in Judea must flee to the hills.
All right, so that is pointing to our destruction of the temple. And does it say the reader should understand this in parentheses?
Yeah, reader, pay attention.
Reader, pay attention. So the hearer or reader of this in the first century or after 70, well, you should understand this because you know what it means. We're starting to see this secret in the book of Mark, that the reader understands, but other people don't. In fact, all throughout this book, when you read it, watch for what the disciples do and do not know about Jesus. They don't even get it most of the time. But and when I took the class on the book of Mark, we thought of them like the 11 Stooges or 12 Stooges because they just couldn't get who Jesus was. But yet the demons knew who he was. The people who he healed knew who he was. But the disciples, the people closest to him, could not understand who this man was. They knew he was a teacher, they knew that they would follow him, and they knew he did great stuff, but they just couldn't figure out who this Jesus guy was. So, Jody, the original ending of Mark, 1-8.
When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salem bought spices, so that they might go and anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene. He was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
Okay, so that's the original ending that you would have read if it was 71 or 72 the year was. What does that tell you? At the very end, what's that last line?
They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
And this goes back to that secrecy. They said nothing to anyone. Well, in 2018, what do you think that doesn't work, does it? We know that they told someone. And now the reader or the hearer of this story would be like, hey, I'm in on this big secret. I know who this person was. But it's being hidden from everyone else. That would go along with Paul's writings. A lot of the house churches, they were being persecuted, so they met in houses kind of in secret because they didn't want to be persecuted. This work would have brought you into the secret. It would have allowed you to be part of the club, so to speak, of people who know who Jesus is. Because now, at this time, there would still be no Gentiles that follow Jesus. At this time, there would only be Jews that followed Jesus, but there would also be Jews that didn't. There weren't Christians yet. And so you would be set apart from the Jews that didn't know Jesus. You would be set apart from the Gentiles. You would have this gem of knowledge that no one else has. And you have to be careful with it, because if you tell the wrong person, what happens? I would have done that, yeah. It's over. If you tell the wrong person, you're an insurrectionist. Now, there were other endings added later. How many more endings are there? Does your Bible say? So before the DVD came out, that was the original ending. Nobody ever laughs at that. There are 2 other endings, 3 other endings. And the reason they did that was Matthew was written. Matthew ends with the Great Commission. Go and baptize everyone in all nations. And that's in one of these. Before that, there's one that's just like a verse 9.
I have 9 through 20.
There should be a 9 and a 9 through 20.
That's what I have.
What's the original verse, or the first verse 9?
When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him and who were mourning and weeping. When they heard that Jesus was alive and that she had seen him, they did not believe it.
Okay, so why would we add that to the book? Because it wouldn't make sense in light of the other Gospels. And that's why when we look at Mark, we're going to stay around this area here. We're not going to get into the other Gospels even existing. And I want to say this. The fact that we have this book is in itself amazing. Mark comes from a whole another time, another culture, and some terms that they use in the Bible, we have different uses for now. Like today's the Epiphany. Has anyone ever had an epiphany? Oh my goodness, that's how that works. Aha, that's what they meant. But that's not the original meaning of the word. Mark was not intended originally to be for us. Now, through God's greater plan, God's greater designs, we have it today. But we have to understand while we're reading this gospel, we are looking into a window into a world that we know nothing about, that we don't understand, because to us, it's alien. I mean, now, some of you have traveled. Has anybody been to a third world country? Okay, so you've been to a third world country. How different is it from day to day there and day to day here? What are some things, what are some differences?
Well, I guess just the way they live, I guess. When we look at where we're at, like our modern day and time isn't an issue as much.
So they don't have calendars and schedules and,
No, I mean, not where we went, they didn't really, each day was a new day.
well, that's kind of the way most third world countries are. And that would have been, aside from the holy events at the temple, those would have been the only markers of time. There wouldn't have been at 10 a.m. I have a meeting with Wayne. At noon, I have to have lunch with my wife. It was just kind of as it happened.
Yeah.
Mark is and that's another reason why immediately kind of strikes people, because there was no immediately. There was no urgency. And Mark's putting this sense of urgency in a place that didn't have urgency. So, I want to say this. It's not the author's job to explain to us why something is significant. When we read Mark and we find something that's significant, that's our job to understand why. Mark is based in a specific historical context and in the story of Jesus. And to understand why it's relevant, we have to really, the things that I've covered, we got to kind of understand that, but then also when we reread and reread this book, we have to remember that we're not reading it in 2018, we're reading it in this time frame. Romans would still be empowered. In my opinion, the temple would be destroyed. We'll talk about why I think that later. And when we talk about the kingdom of earth coming, it's not necessarily what we see in Revelation at the end. It's a new era. An era where the Romans aren't in charge and the Jews are in power of their own destiny, maybe not of the world, but just they're able to be who they want to be. The goal of the kingdom of heaven, when we talk about the kingdom of heaven, isn't always somewhere out there. For the Jewish people, it was, we want to make this into the kingdom of heaven, what's around us. And that's why, one of the reasons I'm real, adamant that we need to do mission, because I still think that that is how we make things right. So far we're about 30 minutes in, so anyone have any questions so far?
If this were not the recording of Peter's sermons and what he remembered and all that, then what was the source of the book?
So the majority of stories were done through oral tradition. In the Jewish faith, let's say Gina and I are married. Who gets the last name? She gets my last name. If we have kids, who gets the faith? Or who gives them the faith? Mother, because dad's off working, and mother's the one telling the stories to the kids. Oftentimes, and women had a network that the men didn't have. The men had their trade associations, their guilds, the things that they did professionally. Women had each other. They would communally raise children. Let's say, for instance, all the women in this room have kids. They would all tell them the stories together. They would do stuff together. So Mark, in essence, the person that actually wrote this down, whether it's the interpreter of Peter or not, actually took those stories and wrote them down. And the reason that's significant, like when we talk about Legion, is the women had encoded certain words because the Romans would have just been in earshot. They weren't allowed to do much without Romans interfering with stuff. Much less, and that meant raising kids. It was kind of overseen by the Romans. No, there wasn't a Roman in a schoolhouse. They didn't have a schoolhouse. But the stories that were passed down, when a Roman would say, are you being an insurrectionist? No, I'm just telling a story. But there's this other layer, this underneath, that's telling a more political, more subversive story. And it's telling the kids, hey, this is the world we live in where we have to be careful like this. Does that kind of answer it, or not at all?
Yeah. The Bible that I have is pretty strong that it was recording Peter's thoughts.
And up until probably, I'd say up until probably the 1960s, that was the common thing. We're still learning so much about this. And while it may be that Peter's translator did transcribe all of this, if he were a translator, he'd understand the language well enough not to use immediately over and over. But at the same time, what I want to say is it's not important who wrote it. It's important that it was written. The authorship of the first 5 books of the Bible are attributed to who? Moses. But in the last book of those 5, he writes about his own death and how humble he was, and what happened, after his death. How would he write that? He couldn't. And we do know that those other 2 endings were added on afterward because it didn't make sense, especially in the era of Matthew and then later in the era of John, where we knew about a resurrection, but Mark didn't tell about it, and we wanted the Gospel of Mark to look more like the other Gospels. I'm surprised that they didn't put in a genealogy and a birth narrative at that same time when they changed that ending.
Don't you think we also have to realize how many times it's been written and rewritten and told first over and over and added to, taken away from, and then you've had it written, rewritten in their language, and then you have King James who came in and had the whole thing rewritten.
Oh, and there are unicorns in the King James Version of the Bible,
Yeah.
but they're not unicorns in the other versions. It is important that, and I use a CEB or a NASB. I've got my NASB here. I think these are closer word for word. The NRSV is closer idea by idea. But to really translate, and I learned this when I was taking the languages, when you really try to translate something and you try to do it word for word, especially with something where the language has changed over time, you can't do any justice to the text word for word. Because sometimes a word will translate as another word, that's great, but I really need a sentence to help the reader understand what that word, the depth of that word. And I use this all the time. People say, why'd you do the languages? Because it's not required. So I love my wife. I love tacos. Is it the same love? I hope not.
She don't.
But you know, when you're talking about the words and stuff, it helped me so much about your sermon, about saying that the word that was used for stable back in those days was really somebody's home.
Guest room, yeah.
That makes so much more sense to me. I don't have room in the house. It's full. I've had it, because they came from everywhere. You know, probably they did go to some place that was out there and stuff, but it makes so much more sense to me. I really almost had an aha moment.
An epiphany.
And I never could understand how Joseph, because back in those days, they did not help deliver. He wouldn't have known what to do. If she was there by herself, he
No.
wouldn't have known what to
And
do.
why didn't we mention the midwives?
That's right, absolutely. So maybe there was other people from different areas that were related that came into the area that didn't have room also. So there probably were other women out there that could have helped Mary with it.
Well,
was
and the
something
way
that
a
was
house
like,
would have been set up in that time, it would have been like, what do we call it, where your house, you have two level, it's not really a two-story, but
yeah,
it'd be a two-level.
they had that,
Level.
they had animals down below.
Exactly,
And they would have
and
lived
so the stable, that would have been that family's, or Joseph's family's animals. Part of the reason, again, why they would have given birth there as opposed to in the house, one of the 613 commandments has to, well, a lot of them, have to do with blood and being unclean. And you're about to enter the, you're back in your home. A woman gives birth in the house, there's blood involved. What does that make the house?
Unclean.
Unclean. Guess what? Nobody can stay there for 8 days while it's cleansed.
Yeah,
Well, we got a problem. We got 30-something people in our house.
yeah.
We can't just boot them all out.
Didn't back in those days, like when women had their monthly cycle and
Mhm.
stuff, they really were taken somewhere else.
They had basically a house or a hut
Where
outside
they
the
went
village.
to, because you couldn't be in that house, a man couldn't be around.
But it was neat because that's part of the reason why women had a strong community that men did not. Because a lot of times, things align at certain times, and certain women who were around each other a lot ended up in the hut outside of town together a lot. After a birth, again, and you would start to find that these communities of women were stronger than the patriarch. Now, the funny thing is, if you look at the Old Testament and how it's written, we talk about the patriarchs, and I'm totally off subject right now. But if you look at it, you realize that the society, the men were in charge, theoretically. The women ran the show. If you read the book of Ruth, you'll see that. Naomi is in control of the entire thing. Even though she's subjected to the waves that include the famine, the drought, all that, she can't control that. But when it comes down to what's going to happen with Ruth, here's what you need to do. Now, when I said earlier the Old Testament is a lot more colorful than the New Testament, some of the things that we learn in Mark give it more color. It's not as cut and dry as we initially thought. The New Testament isn't as boring as we initially thought. But we have to pay attention to those words that mean different things now. And I won't cover this as a class, but I'll say it now. When Jesus in Mark says, go into your inner room and pray, he's talking about a bathroom. He's not talking about a closet. They didn't have closets. So Jesus is, in essence, saying that's the only place you're going to get privacy is to go in the bathroom, and us men, we've known that for years. Is anyone surprised by anything mentioned today?
Nope.
Disturbed by anything mentioned? And it's okay. I know my first week in seminary, we had some people quit because, saying so-and-so didn't write this book, or it didn't exactly happen like that. It was kind of shaky. What questions does this raise for you for the coming weeks that we might be able to?
I think for me, I'm with you. I don't care who wrote it. I don't care what the reasons. I'm glad it was written.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I feel about it. I think it was put in there, it's divinely put in there. I think we need to take what we need out of it and just, maybe we're not gonna understand it, maybe we're not to understand it fully. Like you said, because we weren't there, it's generational, we don't understand how they believed and what it meant and the circumstances. I can only know how I would feel back in that time with the Romans. It would be such a scary and dangerous time.
Well, and the Romans were different with the Israelite, or with the Jews during this time frame than they were anywhere else. Anywhere else, they conquered the city, they destroyed the temples. You could practice no religion but what they wanted you to practice. And we would see a little bit of this in Paul's letters, that they still encourage people to worship Caesar as Caesar and to do some of the Roman stuff, but they didn't destroy the temple when they took over. And they had an agreement that said, if you don't try to overthrow us, we'll let your little backwater religion stand. And you can keep doing what you're doing, because we don't think you can harm us when you can't eat bacon, you can't do any of the fun stuff that we do. So you're not strong enough to overthrow us. So go ahead and practice your religion. Mark is written about the time John is written. The Roman Empire is, what do you call it, when you can't get enough blood to the extremities? That was about what was happening in the Roman Empire. They were so stretched thin that they couldn't get supplies, they couldn't get things like that. And so they would, A, get harsher. We see this in military all the time. You don't have enough supplies, you don't have enough backup, you don't have enough this or that. You just start being meaner, because then you terrorize the people. But during the era of Jesus, yes, they still terrorized people, and yes, but they still had a very strong supply. They still had a very strong infrastructure. And so during the time of Mark, they were still allowing the Jews to be the Jews. You have different groups. The Herodians, that was a political group. That was people that followed under Herod's son Antipas, which that would have been the one that killed John the Baptist. Different from the Herod that was after Jesus when he was born. You would have the Sadducees, which were people in the temple. You would have the Pharisees, who were leaders of the synagogue. You would have the scribes who wrote. Now these are all different factions, and they all have slightly different beliefs. And then you have the rebels. Now there were different rebel groups. We learned about one on the way to Muskogee the other day. We weren't doing any biblical research. She was reading. We had an audio book that was kind of fun. But all these different rebel groups were kind of like the different church factions or temple factions. They weren't united. So when the Romans say the rebels, they're referring to 100 different groups as one group. You had different patterns of thought within Judaism. You had Hillel, which was the most established of the elders, and then you had another elder who was, he was pretty established, but one was very conservative, one was very progressive. And then you had other rabbis that were kind of aligned either side, but had different beliefs, kind of like our denominations today. We have, Methodist, Baptist, Catholics, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Unitarians, and a lot of others. So when we look at Mark is written to anyone that can read it. And it doesn't matter if they're Pharisee, Sadducee, or any of the others. When you read Mark, you don't see a lot of the, where I said earlier, I used to think John was a great book to start people off on, until I realized how anti-Semitic John is. Who kills Jesus in John? The Jews. But in the other books, it's the elders and the scribes and the Pharisees who conspired with the Romans. But in John, it's the Jews. So again, that's why context plays an important part of when these are written. John is primarily in trying to get people to believe in Jesus, and not so much that they have to be Jewish. Matthew is very concerned, and we'll talk about this more next week. Matthew is very concerned with the Jewishness of the followers of Jesus. And how do you follow the 613 Levitical laws and follow this guy? So when you read Matthew, and we'll look at these two side by side, you'll notice that one talks more about law and one talks more about Jesus. And then Luke, who wrote Luke and Acts, is more concerned about how we treat the poor. It's not written for the poor, it's written for the rich people who can read on how to treat the poor.
In the NIV, it says the book of Mark, which stresses facts and actions rather than themes and topics, is the most exciting account of Christ among the Gospels.
It's a very short action movie. When you immediately go here and immediately go there, it kind of gets this tempo. Mark was a Dragnet. Y'all remember Dragnet?
Yeah.
What is the tagline of that? Just the facts, man.
Yeah.
Mark wasn't interested in what might have happened. When we talk about compiling, there were hundreds of stories of what Jesus did. Why did Mark only pick certain ones? Because those were the ones that probably 2 or more people and this book of Q said. Well, and when we look at Matthew in comparison, we'll see that there are some things that the other Gospels put in there that Mark doesn't. And the reason why is, well, I've heard 3 stories and they got all of these things the same. This is the story I'm going to use. These added things, the other people can read. And so I think that if we look as close to historical as we can get, knowing that this isn't a history book, I think Mark is the most accurate. There's a Jesus seminar which looks at the statements of Jesus, and they put them in 3 categories. Probably said, possibly said, and definitely didn't say. In Mark, the majority of what Mark says is in the first 2 columns. And that's, for me, interesting, because that means that we don't have to worry about Mark being what Jesus didn't say and somebody else wanted Jesus to say. It's probable or possible that Jesus said everything that's in the book of Mark.
From the beginning, has it been called Mark?
Yes.
From the very beginning?
Yeah, so Mark
So
was,
does that mean it was somebody named Mark?
Not necessarily.
Or did somebody else name it?
so Mark, again, the authorship we would have attributed to somebody who was close to Jesus. So being the interpreter of Peter, who is a disciple of Jesus, is pretty good. But Mark is such a common first name. There's a couple of scriptures in Luke and Acts that talk about Mark, and they think maybe they're talking about this Mark. But then Luke and Acts was written later. But Mark was so common of a name at that time, kind of like,
John.
John's common. James was common when I was a kid. It was just a common name, so we don't know 100% that it was that Mark or any, but we know that it was attributed to the Mark that was the translator for Peter. Other questions? The bell has one. All right, so your homework, and not necessarily for this week, because I know Mark is just such a long book. Read the book of Mark. If you can read the whole thing, awesome. I know I can, but I'm a dork. If there is a particular story that you want to delve deeper in, let me know. You can write it down, bring it with you next week, or you can email me, or call me, or text me, because some of these stories we might be covering, and some of them I might leave till later. But I definitely, if you have a question about a story in particular, I do want to cover it. All right.